Hello and welcome to Intro to Inkle Weaving. I am in SCA, I am Serena Calandra, and in Intro, I am Calandra Dracula. And we're going to go over what inkle weaving is and how to get started. There are a lot of different things, so I'm going to bring up documents and show some things to get started here. The first thing is, what is inkle weaving? So the term inkle actually applies to different styles of weaving, but it in general means a narrow band. And what we're going to look at is this type that is what's called warp face, and I'll explain that in a moment, and plain weave. There are other types that we often see in our medieval groups, such as tablet weaving, that is also technically inkle, but that is a very different weave structure. I'd like to start with some basics on terms. So warp, it has two different meanings in weaving. One is that the warp threads are the vertical threads on your loom that you put on. Now, warping, or to warp your loom, also means to put the warp threads on your loom. Now, the weft, here in the picture, you see this shuttle, which is what you put your weft threads on, and the weft is the thread that you weave with. Now, some other basic terms is that the shuttle is what we put the weft threads on, and then the shed. Now, the shed, I will demonstrate here in a few moments what that is. And that's going to be where when you pass the shuttle through the threads, it goes through what's called a shed. And in this type of weave, there are two of them. Now, in a warp-faced weave, how you warp the loom determines your pattern. And I'm going to show how we set that up here in a moment. Now, I do have a lot more things in this handout. I'm not going to have this up this whole time, so please bring that up if you can, and you can go through things. I may not go through things in order, but I do not have a step-by-step instruction in here. I'm not very good at writing those out. Those are better to find on other sites. There is a book referenced on here. The bottom, make sure I get the title correct on here. The Weaver's Inkle Pattern Directory by Ann Dixon. I highly recommend that book. It is recommended on many other sites as well, and it has all the basics with inkle and also how to do a lot more complex things in different patterns as well. And that is a very good resource, but there are also some other good ones out there. I do also have links on two of the handouts to different pattern generators to make your own patterns. But I'm going to show some examples of some weaving before I switch back and start showing how to get started. So this right here are 3 different bands showing differences, and they're all the same colorway. So you can see there's many different ways of how you can arrange it. Common uses for these type of bands include as belts, trims. In modern world, many people use them for guitar straps, dog collars and leashes, and things like that. You can use them for bookmarks, and you can weave them extremely narrow and make shoelace type things, and you can make them big, make pouches and belts. I did want to show something before getting started, that these are actually, these 3 that I have up right now, these are woven with yarn. And the one on the right here, the red, green, and white, is actually done with acrylic yarn. I know for SCA purposes, we usually don't use a lot of acrylic, but sometimes in other groups and things, we may use different types of yarns. And this is one of those uses that if you're just starting out and wanting to practice, Red Heart yarn actually does work well for this because it has very little stretch to it. So it is something that is usable. It's just caution with using yarn is that any sort of stretch may cause some problems with the tension. And so I don't recommend it necessarily starting out with wool yarns. I do like smooth cottons. Number 10 cotton is a common one that's easy to find at most craft stores, including Walmart. Okay, so I'm going to stop this and go to the looms to explain some different things here. So Inkle looms come in many different sizes and shapes. This one specifically is made by a company called Windhaven Fiber Tools. And these are handmade and it takes a really long time to get them, but they are very good quality and come in many different sizes. This one is the Minstrel. And even though it's small, it actually weaves about 5.5 feet. So that's pretty good. That bigger one here, you can see the size comparison, weaves about 9.5 feet. And it's a Becca. Some other brands that are good that you will commonly find are Shocked and Ashford. Those are both linked in the, or mentioned in the handout. Part of the ways people like using the Inkle loom is because you can see how, with being set up with the pegs the way they are, that you can create something really long in a compact little area. Now, the loom itself is a fairly recent invention from the 20th century of this style of loom. There are examples in period and pre-1600 of this type of weaving being done, but it was usually done in a different way. Common setups that you'll find in different areas of the world include what's called a backstrap setup, where one end is anchored to the person and the other end is anchored to a fixed object. This is actually still commonly done in Central and South America. And also Guatemala and Peru in general still do a lot of backstrap weaving, and they will incorporate plain weave along with things called pickup, where you pick up some of the warp threads and push some of them down instead of just all of them coming up at once and all going down, and can create a lot of different patterns. There are period examples out there that you can find pre-Columbian for areas in the Andes. They're used, this method with the backstrap and plain weave was used for coca bags and other straps. And there's also examples out there, if you look up the Hallstatt finds in, I believe it's Austria. I could be wrong on that. There's a lot of examples with that as well. It's just more commonly you're going to find the tablet woven, but you can tell usually by looking at it, the structure is very different on that. Okay, so another example that I have detailed in the handout, I'm not going to go too much into it unless somebody has a question on how that's set up, is using C-clamps to set up your loom. So what I would do with that is have one end tied to the dowel rod, or to one dowel rod, and then you would tie the other end to another dowel rod. And if you had C-clamps, you could put one on each side of the dowel on one end and then another on your other end of your table. I think a TV tray is actually a good working space for that. And to get it started, after I have things tied on, I take a second dowel, which allows you to roll up things a little bit. And then you can take hair tie or rubber bands and put it on each side of the dowels to secure it, and that will keep it clamped in place. And so that end would be go on the far end. And then the other end that you would, so this would be all your excess that you would have rolled up. And then I'm pretending I'm two C-clamps right now. So my far hand is a C-clamp, and then the one towards the camera or towards me would be the other one. And you would then tie that to the dowel. And as you're weaving, and your weaving progresses, so you have things clamped between the two dowel rods, you can roll it up and help maintain the tension that way between the two things. So that's a way to get started if you don't have a loom. With the back strap, oftentimes people will tie it to a dowel rod and then tie that to a belt that goes around your back, and then attach the other to a door or a tree or something that's not going to move. Now, with that, you will need what's called a heddle rod. And I'm going to explain heddles here in just a moment. Heddles, oftentimes with Inkle looms, are going to be made out of string. I am using number 10 cotton, is how I prefer to make my heddles. Now, on a loom, they're all going to be very different on how they're set up and how you would make. And how you would make your heddles. Most looms will tell you in the instructions which pegs to use to make your heddles. You can also measure out and take a piece of wood and hammer 2 nails and make a jig to do it. But how I like to do it is I go over the heddle, sorry, the rods that I'm supposed to with this, and I do a square knot to get it in place, which is right over left and under, and then left over right and under. And I do that 3 times. I've found that doing it just once, sometimes with the tension of everything, the knots will come undone. And doing it 3 gives you leeway that over time, if one of the knots comes undone, you're still going to have your heddle in place. So see there, I've made between those bags of heddle. I usually make all the ones that I need at once and then take them all off. And we have that. It may take some trial and error to make sure that you have them the right size. Because if they are too short or too long, then they will cause issues with the weaving part. So I will demonstrate that here in just a moment. I'm just going to make one more heddle and we'll show how to go through the process of starting to work the loom. Now you can also use what's called a rigid heddle. They come in very different sizes, made out of different materials. They're often made out of wood, and they'll have slots and holes that you can alternate where the threads go. And there are examples of those being used on box looms and also on other devices where you just have anchor between 2 points, and using the small rigid heddle to create your different sheds. Before I go any further, I'm going to explain what that looks like and how the heddles work here. And we're going to demonstrate working in a moment. But on this one, these are my heddles. And you see how there's a space in between here. So this is one shed of where we would pass the shuttle through. So it's created by raising and lowering. So I push up here, that raises, and that's one shed. I push down, and it goes, see, it goes down through these heddles here. That creates the second shed. Now, when I explained about the heddles being too short can be a problem, these are actually smaller than they should be, because I will admit I messed up when I worked things. All of these heddles were actually meant for this little loom. So that's what I have right now. But I already worked it, so we're going to leave it, and it works. It's a little bit better than if they were too long, because then it can cause a problem trying to raise and lower everything. So getting started. I am going to demonstrate with yarn because it's going to be easier to see it. I am using worsted weight cotton yarn, the whatever in cream. It depends on what store you're going to, whether it's peaches, lily, sugar. It's really easy to come by, and it's a good yarn that doesn't have much stretch to it. And I pull it, you see it's not really moving much. That's what you want to look for in a yarn. You can weave with other things, some other wools and stuff. It's just I find that when you're learning, cotton is a good place to start. I also like number 10 crochet cotton. Comes in many different colors. You can find it at any craft stores, including many Walmarts as well. But when you're getting started, a yarn will give you a quicker start to things. You don't have to use as much as if you're using the thinner stuff. Okay, so for getting started, I like to start by anchoring the thread to my loom. Some of them have a foot peg or a foot post, like on this one right here, that makes it easier, but this one does not have one that's near. So what I'm going to do, well, first of all, I'm going to put my tension peg in the right place. Now, this is my tension peg. This is, see how it has a slot? So it can be moved forward and backwards and help adjust the tension. On some looms, it's actually a paddle that's usually up here towards the back. If the loom does not have a tension peg, I would advise not really using it. The first one I used did not have one, and it caused a lot of problems. Or if you do use it, don't do what's called a continuous warp, which is what I'm going to show here. And if you have questions on that, I can answer that part later. Okay, so I'm going to start by, I like to do a slip knot. So I do that by crossing there, pulling up a loop. I do actually have a video on all the knots that I mention here are in a video on my YouTube channel for Knots for Artisans. And so I'm attaching it with a slip knot to my tension peg, which is at the spot that I want it. I generally like to have it where there's a little bit of room, like about an inch. You don't want to move it all the way forward, because then if your tension gets too loose, you have nowhere to move this peg. So I mentioned a continuous warp. What that means is that all of my threads are going to be attached to each other. And when you do the warping, every other thread is going to have a heddle on it. I usually start mine with a heddled thread. So that, in this case, that means I am going to start with going up here. This peg here is where my heddles are going to go. I said every loom is different on its warping path. Use this here to raise that up a little bit. I'm not doing the full warping path on this one, just enough to show the difference here. Okay, so I went through once. Now I'm going to go and put my second thread on. I'm doing 2 threads of the same color next to each other. So this next one goes under this peg. Well, actually, before I do that, I need to put the heddle on. So let's get the heddle. There. Okay, so the heddle is a continuous loop, and I'm going to just place it on top of that thread. So I have my 2 loops down here, and I'm going to slide it onto the heddle bar. So that is the first thread. So the next one goes under that top one. And then loops around. So now I'm going to show how to change color. So we have a heddled thread and an unheddled thread. Now changing color. This is where things get fun. So I'm going to cut that one off. I'm going to tie the next thread to that one. I like to use an overhand knot, just where I take the two ends and make a loop and then pull the ends through the loop. I will usually tie two of them. I'm not going to do that here because I'm not going to keep this on here, but I usually tie two just in case something comes undone. So these are tied together. So then my next one, this is going to be a heddle. So we're going to go on the top again and then follow my path. And I can actually see where I make a little issue there. There we go, just that. Okay. So now we put on the other heddle. And I'm going to do one more and show how I would finish this off to get started. Okay, so the reason why I tied a knot is to make it easy to get things off of whatever I tied it to. And then I can just take that slip knot from that first one and pull it out. And then I'm going to take, this is my ending thread, the white one. The green one is the one I started with. I'm actually going to trim a little bit off of that green just to make it easier to tie the knot. And I use a square knot to tie these together so that I can get it right up against the starting dowel rod. And usually I would tie a couple different knots, do about 2 or 3 square knots to make sure everything's secure. And so everything is one continuous warp. I like this method because I actually find it's easier to balance the tension out by doing it this way. The alternative is, after I'd gone around with the first thread, tying it off together. Like, so each one would be its own loop for each thread that you put on there. But I find that's harder to balance the tension when you do that. Before I would start weaving, I would loosen my tension peg and then pull it as far forward as I can, and then tighten it up. And then that heightens my tension to make it easier to raise and lower the shed. I'm going to demonstrate how to get started in the weaving with the other loom. So let's bring that one over. So this one's definitely having some tension issues. It's a little bit too pliable there. Sometimes you don't want it super tight. It just depends on the yarns you're doing and what you're trying to do in your loom. This one's a little more stubborn to get adjusted right. I've been using this one for 10 years. Had to replace the tension knob on it a couple times. This is actually a part taken from another loom that I have. So, you know, you get resourceful. This pattern that I have worked up right now is in the handout with the patterns that I gave you. It's somewhere towards the end that has 2 different shades of purple and white on it. So if you want to be able to compare the pattern to the weaving, which I will explain the patterning in a moment. I'm going to go through getting started on this first. There are different ways to get started. Some people like to start pretty close to the edge. I like to leave a little bit of room. There are different things that you could do. You could take some dowels or popsicle sticks and put them in, do a couple rows that are just like the spacer sticks to help get things started. Or you can dive right in, which is what I usually do. But I leave several inches to allow for putting fringe on things. I personally always start with the upper shed, meaning raising it up to start with. And I've got my shuttle loaded with the yarn. And I leave a tail, usually at least 6 inches. And how I start things and then how we do the next rows are going to be slightly different. So I'm holding onto my tail and I'm not going to let go of that. But I pass my shuttle through the first shed. Okay, and then I'm going to, actually, I'm gonna hold on to that. I'm going to lower for the return pass. And see, it's all a little wonky right now. We can fix that still. But I've got to open the shed because in which you can use your hands or you can use a knitting needle or a dowel or something if you need to. And I'm going to hold on to this edge here on my left, and I'm pulling my shuttle through. This is the tricky part when getting started. Oftentimes it's the first couple inches may look a little bit weird, and you can always cut that off when you finish or use that, sew that under or something, and it'll hide it. Okay, so I am holding on to this little loop on the side. This is important for helping to get good edges. I'm going to pull this and hold that as much as I can until I get it right next to the edge. Okay, now I still fussing with that tail there because there's something we're going to do with that. Okay. What I like to do is I like to trap my starting thread in the band. Now this is optional. You could just leave this out and just keep weaving and just deal with it at the end. But I'm going to show you how I prefer to do it. So my last shuttle pass I did by pushing the threads down. I'm going to do that again. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to take that starting tail and I'm going to thread it through the opposite direction and then pull both of those. My tail is now trapped in my weaving and I have my shuttle thread, my working thread on the other side, my weft thread. You notice you can pull this really tight and it pulls it in. So you want to watch this of how you get this started will help set the width of things, and you've got to work on the consistency with it. There we go. So my next pass, I'm going to raise the shed and pull my shuttle through and hold on to my loop till I get to the edge there. You see that the weft thread shows just a little bit on the outside, but it doesn't show through the weaving at all. This is what part of making this a warp face weave is that your weft only shows on the outside edges for the most part. If your weaving thread, your weft thread starts showing through, then you need to adjust your tensioning because that usually means that you haven't pulled things as tight as you need to. Sometimes I will go ahead and take the tail and I will weave it through a couple times. So I had raised my shed the last time, so I'm going to pull it through so it's going through that same shed as my shuttle went through. And you could just keep going or just trim off that tail. And so it's trapped in my weaving, so it won't come undone. And this is the basics on how you get started with this, is that with the plain weave, once it's warped, it is just up and down. And it's just the continuing of the raising and lowering and passing your shuttle through. And then I'm going to show how to advance the warp here in a moment. Okay, so this is your weaving space in between the front of the loom and the heddles. Now this one has a pretty large one versus the other loom I showed doesn't have a very large one, and just depends on how you are, how you want to do that, whether you like a large or small space. But eventually you'll get pretty close to the heddles and won't be able to weave anymore. So then you have to do what's called advancing the loom. So you would loosen the tension peg. This one I often have to put it outside because it's such a big loom. And then, let's see if I can show this with this one. I grab the threads here on the bottom and then on the top and gently pull it and it will circle around. So I haven't woven very much, so I don't want to move it around a whole lot. Turn things back up. So everything's all loose because I got to tighten things up. So I will take my heddles and push them back up because they moved forward. And then take the tension peg and retighten it. And so you just keep doing that until you get pretty close to the end. There will be a little bit of waste thread because you'll reach a point where you can't weave any farther. Actually, let me show you the other one. Easier on that. Okay. So it'll get to the point where you won't be able to really push down or the threads and stuff anymore, and you can't get any farther. And so that's when you would just undo the tension peg like this. And then you can take the whole thing off at once. And it'll be a big band and a loop. And you just cut on one side of your heddles, and then that will undo everything. Now, how to finish a band. There are a few different ways to do that. Okay, so I have a band here that has some unfinished ends. So one thing you can do is you could just, like how one of the ways of how we were attaching things, just make an overhand knot and leave the end. Here's an example of that. And just have the ends there. Another thing you could do is make fringe. So you could take a few of the ending threads, and there's fancy fringe twisters you can buy, or just use your hands and just twist it. I'm taking a few of the threads and twisting it really, really tight. And I'm going to take another group and twist them. And then two together and twist the opposite direction of how they were twisted. And they twist up together and make a little rope. And you can just make an overhand knot. And you have fringe. Other things that you can do for finishing them. Let's see. Undo the knot on this one to show what I would do with it. Okay. You can sew the ends down. I've gone across before sometimes and just do like a chain stitch across or a back stitch by hand, but that thread will show. You can also, say you're adding this onto a garment, you can fold the ends in and then roll it up just like you were doing a hem. And then sew over the top. I don't recommend using a machine. I do prefer to do it by hand, but you can use a machine with a zigzag stitch. It's better than a straight stitch because doesn't always go all the way through with the straight stitch on a machine. That's why by hand you can control it better and make sure that you're catching everything that you need and catch those raw edges. So that's the basics on getting started with the weaving. Now let's talk about patterns. Let me go ahead and bring up that document.
Before you do that, I do have a question
Yes.
from Sarah. For most Inkle looms, what is the widest band you can make? It might be Mara. I don't know. I pronounce everything weird. Sorry.
That would be Mara. Okay, so this one is about, I think the pegs are about 7 inches. So about 6 inches wide would be about the widest that you would want to do on it. That's pretty common for a lot of looms that you can only weave about 4 to 6 inches. There are some out there that you can do wider, or you could do the backstrap setup with dowel rods to be able to control to have a wider one. I do have a double-sided loom called a Windhaven accordion that actually has rods that are 12 inches, so I could weave 10 inches on it with that. Now, I've seen some South American weaving with a backstrap setup where they are weaving things that are about 2 feet wide. So it's a matter of what your patience are and how you want to sit down to weave things. I often do not have the patience to weave anything wider than this, which is about 2.5 inches, but sometimes I have woven wider things. Okay, so let me go ahead and bring up the patterns, or how to make patterns. Okay. So some common things with patterns, I'm going to go ahead and go down to the graph here to explain how this works. In weaving, 2 strands next to each other of the same color makes a solid line. So that here we have color A and color A. Because this is on the top graph here, what this looks like when you're looking at Inkle patterns is most of the time the ones in the top are going to be heddled. On some patterns, they will be marked, the heddled threads will be marked with a little dot above them. But often it's commonly understood that you have this graph here. So this is thread, your first thread. Then down on the bottom, that is your second thread. So I have a pink one and then another pink one that'll be unheddled. And then the third thread is going to be heddled and it's green. Then the fourth thread will be unheddled and be pink. And my fifth thread here is heddled and it will be pink. The boxes that are just white and don't have a letter next to them, those are not threads. Now, other ways that it might be labeled, like on the pattern document, you'll see that the boxes are all just next to each other. And the first box has a dot above it, which means it's heddled. And then the next box doesn't have a dot, so it's unheddled. So what would happen in this pattern that I have here is I would have a solid line of pink because I have 2 of them next to each other. Then a dashed line of green in the middle, and then would have another solid line of pink on the other side of it. Now, if these all alternated and were A, B, A, B, A, you would actually get horizontal stripes, horizontal lines going across. And so that's the basics of understanding. We can go into more depth of patterning if you have more questions on that. Also, the things that are linked down here are helpful resources. I like the Carolingian realm. That's the one that I use most of the time. The other one here with the rack truss is also Saizen, and it allows you to get more in depth with your patterning, and you can create pickup patterns and other things with it. It's a little more complicated to use, but it's a really good one as well. And then I have links to some places that if you wanted to graph out your own patterns, this type of bead graph paper actually works really well because it's offset, so you can easily be able
I'm,
to.
I'm sorry. Do you have a graph up? Are you trying to share your screen? Because it's not showing.
Okay, I apologize that
Sorry.
it's not showing. Let me pull that back up.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, it did not take when I was trying to. Let me pull that up here. Okay, so I'm looking at the designing patterns. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Didn't realize it wasn't sharing it. Okay, so this is what I mean that things are offset. So the white boxes, these are not threads. The ones that are threads are the ones that have the letters in them and the colors. And so the top lines are heddled. The bottom row is unheddled. And so this is where I mean of having two things of color A next to each other makes a solid line. And then this one, the B that will be heddled, will be a dash of green. And then I will end up having a solid line of A because I have two of them that'll be next to each other. Okay. Hopefully that makes more sense. I apologize for that. And then here are the links that I was referencing on there that will be helpful with that. And you can create many different designs with this. Pull up the next one, make sure that it shares the right one this time. Okay. So I am including a link with many patterns that I've created. And so you can see some of the diversity of different things that you can create here. And a variety of different colors, different things. Now, how wide these will end up being depends on what size yarn you're using. So I do have a few smaller patterns in here, which I'm scrolling down to get to those that are a little bit narrower. So like this one is considerably smaller than some of the other ones. This would be better if you're wanting to make a belt type piece, you would want to use yarn with it, like worsted weight yarn or sport weight. If you use size number 10 crochet cotton, it would be very tiny. It would be about shoelace size. This is the one that I have worked up on my loom right now, and you saw how narrow that one got. It looks like it's a lot of threads, but when you're using smaller yarn, what I have on my loom right now is number 5 cotton, and it's a little softer. It can get pretty tight on there. So this one, for example, would be one that if you're wanting to make tiny trim for a sleeve, then you could use number 10 crochet cotton, but it'll be very, very narrow with it. But if you used worsted weight yarn, it would probably come out to about a little over an inch around there and would make a nice little belt. So it just depends on what size yarn you use of how things are going to come out that way. I'll show some comparisons. You can also mix the sizes that you're using. Now I've mentioned a little bit about pickup, which we're not going to go into depth on that because that's a very complicated thing. I do recommend doing plain weave first and mastering your tension, but pickup is what this is. And so this one, instead of just having my going up and down, on some of the passes, I took some of the threads that were in the bottom shed and pulled them up to the top, and some that were in the top and pushed them into the bottom to be able to pull up the pattern. And what helps with this is that the threads are different sizes. So I have a mixture of number 10 and number 5 cotton on this one. In plain weave, you can mix things up too. I actually have 2 different color greens on here. And one color green is number 10 cotton, one is number 5, and the white is number 3. So you can play around with using different sizes of thread too to create differences in your pattern to help accent things. If you just want a little tiny little sliver of color, put number 10 next to number 3, and you'll have a little bit of difference. One way that you can try to get an estimate on how wide your pattern's going to end up weaving up, if you take your yarn that you're using and wrap it around a ruler and count how many times it wraps around in 1 inch, then that tells you how many threads will show on the top in that 1 inch. And then you would want to double it to get how many warp threads you need for this to get the desired one. So say, for example, you're using a yarn and 20 or using the thread and it has 20 wraps in that inch, then you're going to want 40 warp threads or 41, depending on what your pattern is. That's another point with patterns. If you use an even number of threads, you're going to start with a heddled thread and end with an unheddled thread. If you use an odd number, then you'll start with a heddled and end with an unheddled. Both are fine. You just have to look at the pattern, how you're graphing it out, and either one is acceptable. It's just gonna, you just have to keep that in mind, that it's gonna be slightly asymmetrical, but it's really not gonna be all that noticeable to most people. And still works depending on what pattern you're. Most of the patterns that I have in the handout are done with an odd number of threads. There is at least one that is done with an even number. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this here. Just a minute.